Well, welcome to the Stepping Stones Project. My name is Carl Connor, and this is March 22nd, 2015. We are just about done with our study of Esther. This is Esther chapter 8. We'll be wrapping it up next week. I entitled this one, The King's Edict. I had mentioned some of these are going to be kind of on the shorter side. Maybe in retrospect, I could have combined a few, but that's fine. We'll just do it the way they come. So Esther chapter 8. We've gone through the height of the story now, which was the tension of what would happen to the Jews. Would Esther attempt to save them? Of course she does. Take an action, and that action is well received. The result of that is that our foe, if you will, in the story, Haman, ends up dying by the same means that Mordecai had prepared for him. And now we're down to, well, we've got rid of the initial threat, but there still is a law on the books that would result in the Jews being annihilated and tortured in the months to come. So we'll pick up the story at that point, chapter 8, starting at verse 1. And on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. This is a tradition, by the way, that those that oppose the Jews will end up falling not only by their own means, the way that they had intended for the Jews to fall, but additionally that their possessions will fall into the custody of the Jews. This is a sort of a tradition that comes from this time. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken to Haman, and gave it over to Mordecai. So this is interesting. Mordecai has been faithful in that he has attempted to protect the life of the king. You all might recall very early in the story that Mordecai was faithful to tell something of importance about a plot against the king's life. And now we see that the king is now trusting him with his signet ring. So just for the fun of it, put your hands over on the keyboard, and I'm curious if you all know, what's a signet ring? What is that? A signet ring. That's kind of an interesting name. Maybe I should have thrown a picture of it up there. What is that? What's a signet ring? It's a ring with signet in it, right? What does that mean? What's a signet ring used for? Have you ever heard of one before? You might not have. Okay. Eileen says they pressed it into wax as a confirmation and a seal. Paul says the authority and seal of authority, the sign of authority, probably. Yes, absolutely. You're correct. So this is a intricately carven symbol that they're used to ring off of the family crest. You're absolutely correct. That's usually what's there. And this is one way we would now say to ensure that something is authentic. If in the modern age, we would talk about, here's a term, digitally signing something. Or if you go to a banking website, you might see that there's a certificate. And you might say, oh, the certificate, is it valid or not, to make sure this is really Bank of America or Chase or some other site like that, right? Or PayPal, for example. And so that's an idea of something unique that only that person has to demonstrate that they are authentic. Yeah, so the signet ring has usually the crest or the house or something intricate that's hard to make and duplicate. And because of that, then you can when they pour the candle, it's like a wax, so it's a sealing wax onto the document, and then you press into it. You also could do it in clay is another way you can do this, that designates this has been done by the authority of the king. So by the king giving that signet ring, at least temporarily, to Mordecai, he's saying Mordecai is now in charge of speaking with the king's voice. You all follow? And so he's transferred a very substantial portion of his authority then, at least temporarily, to Mordecai to let him be able to then enact laws, for example, on his behalf. Pretty powerful. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman before he killed Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Hamath the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes." There's a whole lot of ifs there. Let's just kind of pause on that and think about this for a second. So she's saying, I'm going to propose something, and only if it makes you happy, if it pleases the king. And then it goes favor, and if I have found favor in his sight. Well, this is an interesting idea, the idea that the king is in a mood or a mindset to address this particular request. So it makes the king happy, and he's in the mood to do so. And if the thing itself seems right, and if I am pleasing in his eyes. So this is kind of an interesting set of ifs there, and I recognize that she's speaking to an earthly king, but you might want to think about that series right there as you're thinking about your heavenly king. So let's just kind of try this for a second. So if it pleases you, God, and if I have found favor in your sight, God, and if the thing I'm asking for, God, is something that you want, and if I'm pleasing in your eyes, God, if I'm being what you want me to be, God, then would you please grant my request? Could you imagine that if you went to pray to God, if those are some of the things that you would put forth beforehand? I have to confess, there are days when I might be pray and ask for a few things less, and that's not my goal here. But I'd have to at least have, like, I got some work to do, if you follow my point. And it's an interesting series of things. Maybe they're sort of canned responses, nevertheless, to put off there. And I'm not suggesting that that's what you need to do before you come to God, because God wants you to come just as you are. But isn't it an interesting set if you kind of think your way through all of the ifs that she's put on there? And if these things, well, then let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, when he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. Now, this is an interesting situation because the king was the one who had a merry wine fest with Haman when the king had first signed off on those exact letters. So she's saying, would you please go back now? Now, this is interesting because in a way the king can